January 28, 1943. The Bavarian winter was cruel that year, colder than memory, sharper than steel. The war had reached a point where even the snow seemed to serve a purpose, hiding things men preferred not to see. On the frozen edge of Lake Constance, 3 Allied intelligence officers stood staring at a thin column of smoke rising through a crack in the ice. It was the kind of scene that should have belonged to a peaceful morning, perhaps fishermen, perhaps campfire, but here, in the gray silence of war, it looked like something far worse. Major Harold Kemp wiped the frost from his binoculars, but the sight did not change. Still rising. Still wrong. The men were not supposed to be there. The area was marked in red on every Allied map, enemy territory, an unspoken border of death. But their orders came directly from London. Investigate reports of unusual scientific activity near the lake. That phrase, Kemp thought grimly, was British intelligence code for something the world shouldn't know. With him was Sergeant Alan Brooks, a soft-spoken radio operator whose humor survived longer than most soldiers' sanity, and Lieutenant Marie Heller, one of the few women working with Allied intelligence in the region. She spoke fluent German and had a sharpness that could cut through lies faster than any bullet. Together, they trudged across the ice, following the faint smoke trail like a thread leading into a wound. When they reached the shore, the source revealed itself. A wooden shack, half buried in snow, its windows blacked out. Inside, they found what at first looked like the remains of a laboratory, rusted metal, shattered glass, papers burnt into illegible ash. But it was the smell that froze them in place. Not smoke. Not decay. Something sterile and metallic, the unmistakable odor of chemicals mixed with blood. On a nearby table lay a stack of German documents, each stamped with an eagle insignia and the words Kaltkammerversuch, cold chamber experiments. The papers described a series of freezing endurance tests conducted on human subjects, mostly prisoners. Some were Soviet pilots, some political dissidents, others, unnamed. Each entry ended with a temperature, a duration, and a clinical note, subject deceased. Kemp's voice, when he finally spoke, was tight. They were freezing people alive to see how long it takes to die. Marie nodded silently, her gloved hands trembling as she turned the pages. Among them, she found a letter addressed to Heinrich Himmler, written by a man named Dr. Sigmund Rascher. My experiments, it read, prove that the human body, under proper control, can endure exposure to freezing temperatures for up to 3 hours. This knowledge may aid our pilots downed in icy waters. For the Reich. For the Reich. The words burned colder than the air around them. Brooks muttered something about monsters, but Kemp said nothing. He had seen men die before, by bullets, by fire, by hunger, but this was different. This was death by curiosity. The team took photographs and samples, packing evidence into sealed tins. They were professionals trained to observe, not feel. But Marie couldn't look away from one particular photograph pinned to the wall. It showed a young man strapped to a chair, his face locked between pain and disbelief. Someone had scrawled beneath it, Test Subject 23, survived 70 minutes. In her notebook, Marie wrote only one line. He had a name once. By nightfall, they returned to their camp near the border, but none of them spoke much during the journey. The wind howled like a witness refusing to be silenced. When they radioed London, Kemp summarized the discovery with military restraint, evidence of medical atrocities confirmed. Location secure. Awaiting extraction. He didn't mention the eyes in the photograph or the way Marie had to look away before packing it. Some details, he thought, were too human for reports. That night, as snow thickened over their tents, Brooks broke the silence. You think we're any better? He asked softly. We drop bombs on cities. Kids freeze there too. Maybe not in labs, but still. Marie shot him a tired glance. Intent matters, she said. They froze people to learn how to kill more efficiently. We're trying to stop them. Brooks shrugged. Maybe. But death doesn't read intentions. Kemp listened without speaking. In his pocket he kept one of Rascher's letters, folded carefully. He told himself it was for evidence. But a part of him, one he didn't like to acknowledge, wanted to understand how men like Rascher justified their horrors. Perhaps that was the most frightening part, that evil could dress itself in the language of research, of progress, of patriotism. Days later, when the documents reached Allied command, the reaction was swift and discreet. The reports were classified immediately, marked not for public release. The world, they said, was not ready to confront such things. Kemp received a new assignment. Marie was sent back to intercept Nazi communications. Brooks never made it home. His convoy was hit near Strasbourg. War devoured men faster than truth could be told. Months passed, and yet Kemp could not let go of the image of that frozen lake. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the rising smoke and the figure of the man in the photograph. Test subject 23. He imagined what it must have felt like, the creeping numbness, the slow surrender of warmth, the final confusion between life and death. In another life, perhaps, he might have been the one in the chair. Fate, he thought, had poor taste in fairness. The deeper conflict began not on that ice, but within the hearts of those who found it. Kemp had entered the war believing in clear lines, good and evil, right and wrong. But the discovery at Lake Constance blurred everything. If such atrocities could exist in a world supposedly fighting for civilization, then what did civilization even mean? Marie wrote to him once, months later, from an undisclosed location. Sometimes, she wrote, I think the real war isn't between nations. It's between conscience and convenience. He kept that letter folded beside Rasher's. 2 documents, one in the language of cruelty, the other in the language of doubt. Together, they told a story history would prefer to forget. In 1945, after Germany's surrender, Allied forces officially uncovered Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, names that became symbols of inhumanity. But the smaller stories, like that frozen lake, never made headlines. They were buried under victories and parades. The scientists responsible were tried, some executed, some vanished. Rasher himself was reportedly shot by the SS for corruption, though Kemp doubted justice had anything to do with it. Years later, when new wars began and the old ones faded into textbooks, Kemp read that certain data from those freezing experiments had been quietly used in postwar research on hypothermia and survival. The irony was almost unbearable. Knowledge born from torture was now saving lives. It was the ultimate moral riddle. Could something born in evil serve good? And if it could, did that justify the means? Kemp never found peace with the answer. The war had ended, but the questions it left behind never did. He often thought of the moment he first saw the smoke rising from the ice, how it had seemed like a signal, an SOS from history itself. Maybe the real secret of that day wasn't hidden in the experiments, or the letters, or the classified files. Maybe it was hidden in the silence that followed, in the decision to look away. And so the story pauses there, in that uneasy silence, between what was seen and what was buried. The frozen lake still exists, though most who walk by it now see only a reflection of clouds and mountains. The past sleeps beneath it, waiting for someone curious enough, or reckless enough, to dig again. Because some truths, no matter how deep you hide them, have a way of resurfacing. And when they do, they change not just what we know about history, but what we know about ourselves. May 3, 1946. The war had been over for a year, but victory did not smell like triumph. It smelled like dust, ink, and secrecy. In the ruins of a once mighty Germany, a new kind of battle was beginning, one fought not with guns but with files. Major Harold Kemp sat in a dimly lit office in Frankfurt, surrounded by stacks of documents that all carried the same symbol, the eagle and the swastika, now stripped of their power yet somehow still menacing. He had been reassigned to a task he didn't fully understand, cataloging captured German scientists and determining which of them were useful to the new Allied order. The irony was sharp enough to taste. Last year he'd exposed men who froze prisoners to death in the name of science. Now, the same kind of men were knocking politely on the doors of American officers, offering their knowledge like currency. The operation had an official name, paperclip, a tidy little word for a dirty business. The idea was simple: find Germany's top scientists before the Soviets did, and bring them to America to help build rockets, jets, and medicine. It's a race for the future, one colonel had said in Washington's clipped accent. Kemp thought it sounded more like a race to see who could bury the past deeper. He was no longer on the battlefield, yet his conscience was still under fire. Every folder he opened was a moral landmine. He wasn't alone. Marie Heller had returned from her field assignments, now working under the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. Her once bright energy had dimmed, replaced by a kind of brittle calm. She joined Kemp in Frankfurt as a translator and interrogator. Together, they questioned former Nazi scientists, some trembling, others arrogant, many eager to start fresh under new flags. One of them, a tall, polite man named Dr. Victor Schreiber, became the center of their attention. Schreiber had worked in aerodynamics, or so he claimed. His records were impressive: papers on propulsion, notes on flight stability, patents for jet turbine designs that rivaled anything the Allies had. But there were darker pages too, references to biological resilience testing on prisoners of war. When Kemp confronted him about those reports, Schreiber simply smiled, his English smooth and careful. War demands progress, Major. Everyone did what was necessary. Marie's voice was sharper. Necessary for what? For efficiency? For the Reich? For your career? Schreiber's eyes flickered toward her, then down to the folder. For survival, he said softly. Ours or theirs, it doesn't matter. The data survived. That's what counts now. The sentence lingered like smoke. Kemp closed the folder, suppressing the urge to throw it. The worst part, he realized, was that Washington might agree with the man. Reports had already arrived that several German scientists, including those once tied to concentration camp experiments, were being quietly shipped to the United States. Their crimes, it seemed, were being erased by paperwork and new passports. Weeks turned into months. Kemp's desk filled with lists, names of men once condemned now labeled assets. Each decision came with a signature line and a quiet warning: do not discuss outside authorized circles. The words felt like handcuffs. The victory they'd fought for had turned into a shadow economy of silence. Marie began keeping her own notes, private ones. In one of them, she wrote, "Truth is the first casualty of peace." Their superior, Colonel Robert Hinton, embodied the contradiction of the times. He was charming, pragmatic, and utterly without illusions. "Kemp," he said one afternoon, lighting a cigarette with a casual flick, "you need to understand that morality doesn't build rockets. If we don't take these men, the Soviets will. Do you want another war before this one's even cold?" Kemp didn't answer immediately. He looked through the office window at the streets outside, children playing near piles of rubble, mothers carrying water, soldiers drinking coffee that tasted like ash. "We said we were fighting monsters," he murmured, "but now we're hiring them." Hinton gave a weary laugh. "Welcome to the real world, Major. The uniforms change, but the game stays the same." It was hard to argue with him. The tension between conscience and necessity stretched thinner with every passing day. Marie began noticing files disappearing from archives, names erased from indexes. Some of those scientists, she later learned, were already living in Virginia under assumed identities. The United States called it integration. The Soviets called it theft. History would call it something else entirely. Schreiber remained a particular obsession for Kemp. The man carried himself with unnerving composure, as though the war had never ended for him, only changed shape. During one interview, he said something that chilled Kemp to the bone. "You speak of guilt, Major, but tell me, if your country benefits from my work, do you not share in my sin?" Kemp wanted to deny it, but the words cut too close. One evening, while reviewing documents, Marie found an internal memo marked eyes only. It revealed that Schreiber had already been approved for transfer to the U.S. under the sponsorship of the Army Air Forces. She stormed into Hinton's office, the paper trembling in her hands. "You're sending him to America? After everything?" Hinton exhaled smoke slowly. "He's too valuable to waste. He can help with the rocket program. We need him." "And what about the people he killed?" she demanded. "Do they not matter?" "They're dead, Lieutenant," he said flatly. "The living have to think about the future." It was then that Marie realized how wars never truly end. They just change vocabulary. Future was the new justification, the new weapon. Progress had replaced propaganda. And in that transformation, the moral center of victory had quietly shifted. That night, she and Kemp sat by the Rhine, watching the river carry the reflection of distant fires. "Do you ever feel," she asked quietly, "that we're not cleaning up after the war, but just rearranging it?" Kemp didn't answer immediately. The wind carried the smell of burning coal and damp earth. "Maybe," he said finally, "maybe peace is just war wearing better clothes." A small smile touched her lips, sad and brief. "Then I'm afraid we're terrible tailors." The following week, Schreiber was escorted out of Germany under a new identity. Kemp watched the truck pull away, its tires grinding through the gravel like teeth. He told himself he was only an observer now, a functionary in the machinery of post-war order. But as the dust settled, he knew the truth: they weren't just observers. They were accomplices. In the months that followed, the pattern repeated. Scientists with records of brutality vanished into the folds of bureaucracy. Official memos claimed they had no direct involvement in war crimes, a phrase so vague it could fit almost anyone. The files Marie and Kemp had worked to preserve were locked away in military archives, labeled restricted access. The evidence they risked their lives to collect was now a bargaining chip. Still, not all secrets stayed hidden. Rumors spread among lower-level officers about American transports leaving from Bremen, carrying special personnel. The Soviets were doing the same in their zone, Operation Osoaviakim, they called it. It was as if both sides were digging through the ashes of evil, each hoping to find gold before the other. Marie grew quieter. She wrote fewer reports and smoked more. Kemp noticed she no longer looked angry, only tired. "Maybe one day," she said softly, "someone will find out what we did here. Maybe they'll call it necessary. Maybe they'll call it betrayal." Kemp didn't reply. There was nothing left to defend. The ideals that had sent them marching across Europe, the belief in moral victory, felt hollow now. Yet somewhere inside, a spark of defiance remained. If he couldn't stop the lies, he could at least remember them. Before leaving Frankfurt for his next post, Kemp sealed a small package: copies of Schreiber's letters, witness statements, photographs from the lake. He mailed it to a journalist friend in London with no return address. It was a quiet act, invisible against the noise of nations rebuilding themselves. But it was something. A refusal to let silence win. By the time he stepped outside, dawn had begun to break over the ruins. The air was cold, crisp, uncomfortably familiar. Marie joined him, her eyes following the pale light spilling across the city. "Do you think people will ever learn?" she asked. Kemp adjusted his coat, watching the sky. "Only when the truth stops being inconvenient." She smiled faintly, then turned away. Somewhere behind them, the hum of machinery began again, the sound of progress, of rockets, of secrets repurposed. The war was over, they said. But as the morning grew brighter, the shadows beneath it only deepened. And Kemp knew, with quiet certainty, that history was already writing its next secret. October 17, 1952. The rain fell like static against the windows of an anonymous government building in Arlington, Virginia. Major Harold Kemp, now with a few gray streaks in his hair and a permanent tiredness in his eyes, sat across from a man whose name did not appear on any official record. The sign on the door read, "Department of Defense Research Coordination," but everyone inside knew it was just one of the many masks for the new war, a war fought in silence, in laboratories, in the shadows of memory. The Cold War, they called it. But for Kemp, it felt less cold than unfinished. He had thought he'd left the ghosts of Germany behind, but they'd followed him across the ocean, neatly packed into folders marked top secret. The man across the table introduced himself as Dr. Adrian Cole, an American psychologist whose calm, academic tone made every sentence sound like a hypothesis. He spoke of psychological defense mechanisms, human adaptability, behavioral resilience under stress. But Kemp had learned to hear the words that hid behind the words. What Cole was describing was an experiment, a continuation of something that had begun in Europe. "We're studying methods of interrogation, Cole said, almost kindly. Memory suppression, sensory deprivation, suggestion. All for the purpose of defense, of course. Kemp raised an eyebrow. Defense against what? Conscience. Cole smiled faintly, not offended. Against the Soviets, Major. They're already doing the same thing. If we don't keep up, we lose more than ideology, we lose control. It was then that Kemp saw the folder lying on the desk. Stamped across its front were 3 letters, MULTRA. He didn't need to read the fine print to understand. This was Paperclip's legacy, the logical evolution of every moral compromise they'd made in the name of victory. They hadn't buried the darkness, they'd institutionalized it. Later that evening, Kemp met Marie Heller in a small cafe in Georgetown. She'd left the OSS years ago, now working as a journalist under a pseudonym. Time had softened her face but sharpened her voice. "You look like a man who's reading old ghosts," she said as he slid the MKUltra file onto the table. "Or are they reading you?" He didn't smile. "They're experimenting on people again. This time, Americans. Drugs, hypnosis, isolation. Cole calls it research. I call it déjà vu." Marie flipped through the papers, her eyes scanning quickly. CIA front organizations, universities, hospitals. She exhaled. "So this is what all that scientific progress led to." Kemp nodded. "They're using what they learned from Nazi and Japanese data, techniques from Unit 731, psychological notes from Dachau, interrogation logs from Tokyo prisons. They even have Japanese doctors consulting under false names." Her eyes darkened. "And the government knows? They fund it." For a moment, neither spoke. The clatter of dishes and soft jazz from the radio felt obscene against the weight of what they were reading. Marie finally broke the silence. "You think it'll ever stop? This hunger to control people's minds." Kemp stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking softly. "Power doesn't stop when the war ends. It just finds better funding." In the following weeks, they began to dig deeper, tracing connections through declassified fragments and whispered conversations. Kemp used his old credentials to access archives. Marie used her press contacts to question university researchers. They discovered a pattern: dozens of institutions participating in studies funded by mysterious health foundations that were, in truth, CIA fronts. Human subjects were exposed to hallucinogens, deprived of sleep, or placed in isolation chambers for days. The goal, the documents claimed, was to understand how to break and rebuild a mind. One night, Marie found a name buried in a report: Dr. Victor Schreiber. The same man they'd once interrogated in Frankfurt. He had resurfaced in America under a new alias, now working at a facility in Maryland conducting aeromedical stress testing. Kemp stared at the page in disbelief. So he made it here after all. They didn't just forgive him, they promoted him. They drove out to the address listed, a fenced compound surrounded by trees and silence. The guard at the gate refused them entry, of course, but Marie noticed the insignia on the vehicles parked outside, Air Research Division. She whispered, "The same division that brought him over. They never stopped his work. They just rebranded it." That night, as they sat in a cheap motel nearby, Kemp confessed something that had haunted him since the war. "You remember that photograph? The one of the man on the chair at the lake?" Marie nodded. "I see him sometimes," Kemp said softly. "Not as he was, but as he could have been. A teacher, a father. Every time I see another file like this, I wonder how many ghosts we're paying salaries to." Marie didn't respond immediately. She watched the rain streak the window, each drop catching the glow of a passing car. "If evil had a dress code, it would be a lab coat," she said finally. "But maybe the real danger isn't the ones who did it. It's the ones who watch and do nothing." The next morning, Kemp left for Washington to confront Cole. He found the psychologist in his office, adjusting a projector for a presentation titled Behavioral Influence in National Defense. The calmness in Cole's demeanor was infuriating. "You're using people as test subjects," Kemp said flatly. "Without consent." Cole turned, his expression unchanged. "National security demands certain sacrifices, Major." "You sound just like Schreiber." Cole gave a faint, almost pitying smile. And you sound like a man still fighting a war no one remembers. For a moment, Kemp thought about hitting him, but instead he reached into his briefcase and pulled out one of Rasher's letters from the war, the one about freezing experiments. He placed it on Cole's desk. You think this is history? It's your mirror. Different methods, same logic. Cole glanced at the paper, indifferent. Progress isn't moral, Major. It's inevitable. Kemp left before he could say more. Outside, the wind was cold and sharp. He realized then that history wasn't repeating, it was mutating. Each generation found a new way to justify the same sin. Marie published an article a month later under the headline, The Experiments of Silence. It described secret psychological tests, unnamed government agencies, and the haunting connections to wartime research. The article was quickly suppressed. Newspapers refused to reprint it. An anonymous call warned her to drop the subject. Instead, she began preparing a second piece, one that would name names. But before it could go to print, her apartment was broken into. The files were gone. She called Kemp the next day, her voice steady but hollow. They erased it, she said. All of it. Kemp tried to reassure her, but his own office had been searched too. The Rasher letters were missing. He felt an old, familiar chill, the same one from the frozen lake. Truth, once again, was being buried under the weight of convenience. They met one last time, by the Potomac at dusk. Maybe we can't stop it, Marie said quietly. But we can leave a trail. Someone will find it later. She handed him a small envelope, copies of the stolen reports, photographs of the MKUltra experiments. Keep it safe. Kemp wanted to tell her she was wrong, that justice would prevail, that history eventually corrected itself. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he said, "You're still fighting." She smiled faintly. "No, I'm just refusing to forget." 2 months later, Marie's car was found wrecked on a rain-slick road outside Baltimore. The police called it an accident. Kemp didn't believe it, but he knew better than to ask questions. He attended her quiet funeral, a few reporters, fewer friends. No one mentioned the articles. No one mentioned what she'd almost exposed. Afterward, Kemp went home and opened the envelope she had given him. He placed the documents inside a sealed tin, the same kind he had once used to store evidence in Europe. On it, he wrote a single word: silence. He buried it beneath an oak tree on his family's farm in Maine. Not to hide it forever, but to preserve it, like a seed waiting for the right season. That night, as the wind rustled through the branches, Kemp sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey. The world outside seemed calm, children playing, radios humming, headlines celebrating prosperity. Yet beneath it all, he felt the hum of unseen engines, the slow turning of the same old gears. Progress, they called it. He called it memory. He closed his eyes and pictured the frozen lake, the rising smoke, the photograph of the man in the chair, and Marie's last smile. The faces blurred into one another until they became something larger, a quiet question history still refused to answer. How far could humanity go in the name of safety before it lost the right to call itself human? The rain began again, soft at first, then steady. It tapped against the tin roof like fingers insisting on being heard. Somewhere deep inside him, Kemp felt the old conflict stirring once more, the war between knowing and pretending not to. And as he listened to the storm, he realized that the real battle of his life had never been fought on any map. It was fought here, in the silence between truth and comfort. And the silence, as always, was winning. March 11, 1977. The air in Washington, D.C. was heavy with spring rain, the kind that left the streets glistening like old film. Major Harold Kemp, now retired, white-haired, and moving slower than his conscience allowed, sat before the flickering light of a television. The evening news was broadcasting a congressional hearing. Men in suits and glasses, their voices measured but nervous, spoke of something the public had only begun to whisper about: secret mind control experiments, covert drug testing, and a program known only as MKUltra. The words were out now, officially. Kemp leaned forward, his heart slow but loud. After decades of silence, the ghosts were finally being named. The camera cut to a man in his 50s, sharp features and composed hands, Dr. Adrian Cole. He looked almost unchanged since their last meeting 25 years ago, as if guilt had preserved him. The intention, Cole was saying, was to ensure national security during a time of extreme global tension. Mistakes were made, but the objective was the protection of American lives. Kemp felt a bitter laugh rising but didn't let it escape. "Protection," he muttered. "You protected no one." He switched off the TV, leaving the room in a hollow quiet. The world was finally listening, but the truth was still diluted, packaged for public consumption, stripped of its real horror. What no hearing would ever mention were the faces, the screams, the slow erasure of conscience disguised as science. And yet, part of him knew that this was the moment Marie had dreamed of, the moment the silence began to crack. That night, unable to sleep, Kemp walked to the edge of his property. The oak tree still stood there, older, heavier, its roots reaching deep into the soil where he'd buried the tin box decades earlier. The ground was soft from the rain. He dug carefully, his old hands trembling, until the metal surface appeared beneath the mud. When he pried it open, the documents were still intact, yellowed, fragile, but legible. He brushed the dirt away, one page at a time, and stared at the old faces, the old lies. Marie's notes, Rasher's letters, Schreiber's files, they had all become relics of the same disease. As dawn broke, a new thought took root. He couldn't stop the system, but he could give history a chance to remember. He began writing, a detailed account of everything, not as an accusation, but as testimony. He described the cold precision of the Nazi experiments, the comfortable indifference of American officials, and the unbroken chain of moral compromise that connected them. He titled the manuscript "The Science of Silence." For weeks, Kemp worked tirelessly, ignoring his failing health. Each word felt like a release, each sentence a reckoning. Sometimes he imagined Marie's voice, urging him on. Other times, he saw the face of the man in the chair by the frozen lake, his silent witness. He wrote through fever, through tremors, through the pain that radiated down his arm like electricity. He knew he was running out of time. But he also knew he had something left to give, the truth, undiluted. When the manuscript was complete, he sent copies to 3 addresses. One to a senator known for exposing government corruption, one to a small independent newspaper, and one to a young historian named Thomas Heller, Marie's nephew, whom she had once mentioned in passing. He enclosed a note. "She believed people would care. I'm not sure they do. But maybe you will." 2 weeks later, a car pulled up the gravel driveway. Thomas Heller stepped out, a man in his 30s, curious eyes, carrying the same quiet determination that had once defined his aunt. He introduced himself gently. "Major Kemp? I received your letter." Kemp nodded and invited him in. They sat by the fireplace, the manuscript resting between them like a fragile artifact. Thomas flipped through the pages with reverence. "I read Marie's old journals," he said softly. "She mentioned you. Said you were one of the few who didn't look away." Kemp's gaze lingered on the fire. Looking away is easier, but it costs the soul. Thomas leaned forward. "Do you want this published?" "I want it remembered," Kemp said. "The names don't matter anymore. But the pattern does. Every generation finds a new way to justify cruelty. They call it progress, or security, or patriotism. The label changes, but the logic stays." Thomas nodded slowly. "You think people will listen now?" Kemp smiled faintly. "People don't listen. But they remember stories. So tell it well." A week later, Thomas left with the manuscript, promising to share it with editors he trusted. For the first time in years, Kemp felt something close to peace. But peace, like truth, was always conditional. 3 nights later, a black car appeared at the edge of his property. 2 men in dark coats knocked on his door, polite smiles hiding something colder. "Mr. Kemp," one of them began, "we're from the Defense Records Bureau. We've been informed you possess classified material related to national operations from the 1940s. We'll need to retrieve it for proper archiving." Kemp studied their faces. Government men had a certain posture, calm, bureaucratic, untouchable. He'd seen it before in 1946, and again in 1952. It was the same mask, just a new century. "I don't have it," he said evenly. "I already sent it away." The man's smile faltered slightly. "We'd appreciate your cooperation." Kemp didn't move. "You've had my cooperation for 30 years. That's enough." The men exchanged a glance, then left, their car vanishing into the mist. Kemp knew what that meant. The clock had started ticking again. That night he wrote one last letter to Thomas. "If you're reading this, it means they came. Don't stop. Don't let them call it history. It's not over." He placed it beside the typewriter, then sat back, exhausted but calm. For the first time since the war, he felt that his actions might outlive his fear. 3 days later, neighbors found him in his chair, the fire long extinguished, the letter beside him. The coroner called it heart failure. No one questioned it. Months passed. The manuscript resurfaced in small corners of the press, serialized in underground journals and college newspapers. It caused brief ripples, then silence. But not everyone forgot. One evening, Thomas Heller stood before a classroom of young historians at a small university in Vermont. On the blackboard behind him were the words "The Science of Silence." He held up a worn page, the first one Kemp had written. "This," he said, "is not a conspiracy story. It's a human story. About what happens when good people trade their conscience for comfort, when science becomes faith, and when history forgets to look in the mirror." He paused. "The Major once said progress isn't moral, it's inevitable. I think he was wrong. Progress is moral when someone chooses to make it so." After the lecture, a student approached him, curious. "Do you really think something like that could happen again?" Thomas smiled sadly. "It already is. We just don't recognize it yet." Years later, long after Kemp's name had faded from public record, a documentary appeared on public television. Grainy footage, declassified memos, black and white photographs of men in lab coats. The closing shot was a photograph, an oak tree, standing alone in a field, its roots deep, its branches wide. A narrator's voice spoke softly over the image. "History doesn't repeat itself. It waits for us to forget." As the credits rolled, the camera lingered on a close-up of the soil beneath the tree. A small glint of metal shimmered through the dirt, almost invisible, the corner of a rusted tin box. The rain began to fall again, the same steady rhythm that had once echoed on a tin roof in Maine. Somewhere, beyond time and bureaucracy, Major Harold Kemp's silence had found its echo. The ghosts had names again, their stories unburied. And in that quiet convergence of truth and memory, the war, his war, was finally over. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps uncover more untold truths of World War II. Clapperboard fire.